It all started with a fairy tale the world couldn't stop watching. A prince, beloved by millions, seemingly swept off his feet by a woman who promised love, adventure, and a life beyond the confines of royal expectation. The cameras loved them, the tabloids adored them, and the public couldn't get enough of their every move. Prince Harry, the man who grew up under the unrelenting glare of the spotlight, had found someone who appeared to understand him, who could stand beside him, and who seemed to offer an escape from a world built on rigid protocols and constant scrutiny. It was everything he wanted, everything he had hoped for, until the cracks started to appear, subtle at first, almost invisible, but growing with each passing day until they could no longer be ignored. The world only saw the spectacle, the lavish wedding, the global fanfare, the perfectly timed photo ops that portrayed a couple so in love that their happiness seemed untouchable. But behind closed doors, reality was far more complicated. Whispers of doubt, inconsistencies, and unspoken tension began to fill the spaces that cameras and reporters could not reach. Prince Harry, a man who had always carried the weight of family legacy and personal tragedy with dignity, suddenly found himself questioning everything he had believed about the life he had chosen, the woman he had married, and the children he had brought into the world. What would you do if the person you trusted most, the one you had promised your life to, had been orchestrating a world of deception, and you only realized it too late? Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. The evidence, Harry would later reveal, was devastating. He discovered details that shook him to his core, unsettling pieces of information that suggested Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, had never carried Archie or Lilibet. Every public announcement, every carefully staged photo, every interview that portrayed a loving, devoted mother, now felt like a constructed performance, a carefully designed narrative meant to shape public perception rather than reflect reality. For Harry, this revelation was not merely shocking. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than any he had ever experienced. He had believed he was creating a family built on trust, honesty, and love, yet the foundation itself seemed to have been manipulated from the start. The tension within the palace had always been palpable. Harry had grown up witnessing the fragility of royal life, the endless balancing act between personal happiness and duty, and the devastating consequences when truth collided with public expectation. But nothing in his past could have prepared him for the private turmoil he would face once he began piecing together the truth. Questions that had lingered in the back of his mind. Questions about timelines, hospital visits, and media narratives suddenly demanded answers. How could every pregnancy announcement feel just slightly off? Why did certain photo opportunities seem meticulously choreographed rather than spontaneous? Why did the public, the press, and even close friends appear to see what Harry was only beginning to uncover? In the beginning, Harry fought the whispers of doubt with the strength of his love. He wanted to believe. He wanted to see the best in Meghan because he had fallen for her charm, intelligence, and charisma. He wanted the world to see the love that he felt, the same love that he had hoped would endure through scandal, criticism, and the pressures of public life. But as more evidence surfaced, he could no longer ignore the reality. The narrative that had been built around him, his wife, and their children was meticulously controlled. It was designed not for their happiness, but for perception, influence, and power. And the person at the center of that narrative was the very woman he had vowed to spend his life with. The journey from belief to revelation was not immediate. It was filled with moments of hesitation, reflection, and quiet despair. Harry began to notice patterns he could not reconcile. Public appearances, private conversations, and even the smallest gestures began to tell a different story than the one the world believed. The discrepancies were subtle at first, an unusual interview here, a misplaced timeline there, but soon they formed a mosaic too significant to ignore. He began to question the very events that had defined his public life. What had been truth, and what had been a calculated fiction designed for cameras and headlines? Each question brought with it a gnawing sense of betrayal, one that no amount of public adoration could soothe. For those who have followed the Sussex story, it may be tempting to dismiss these revelations as another chapter in a long saga of royal intrigue. But for Harry, this was deeply personal. He was not simply confronting a public scandal. He was facing the reality that the most intimate aspects of his life, his marriage, his children, and his sense of family had been constructed around lies. The psychological toll was immense. Every cherished memory, every shared moment, now carried the weight of uncertainty. The man who had always been celebrated for his courage, compassion, and authenticity was suddenly questioning the very fabric of his existence. How do you reconcile love with deception? How do you protect children when the truth of their beginnings is in question? And perhaps most painfully, how do you forgive someone you once trusted completely when the betrayal feels all-encompassing? The stakes of this revelation are enormous, both personally and publicly. Prince Harry's voice, once reserved for private confidences and personal interviews, now carries a responsibility to disclose truths that have been hidden for years. The implications of his discovery extend beyond the confines of a single marriage. They touch on questions of royal legitimacy, media manipulation, and the broader narrative of trust, power, and image in a family that represents centuries of tradition. What happens when the carefully constructed image of a royal family is challenged not by tabloid speculation, but by intimate knowledge from within? Harry's admission threatens to upend not only his own life, but the carefully maintained perceptions of millions around the world. But Harry's journey to this moment has not been one of mere shock. It has been a story of courage, resilience, and the relentless pursuit of truth. While many might have turned away, denied the evidence, or sought to preserve appearances, Harry faced the uncomfortable reality head-on. He began the painstaking process of uncovering what had been hidden, verifying details, confronting uncomfortable facts, and reconciling his love for his children with the betrayal he had experienced. This was not simply a personal reckoning. It was a reckoning that would reverberate through the halls of power, the media, and the hearts of those who had invested emotionally in the fairy tale narrative of the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Throughout this journey, one question has haunted Harry more than any other. Why? Why would someone he loved, trusted, and built a life with go to such lengths to construct an alternate reality? The answer is not simple, and the exploration of motive, opportunity, and consequence forms the backbone of the shocking story that would ultimately compel Harry to break his silence. For the first time, he would speak not as a prince defined by protocol, but as a man grappling with betrayal, deception, and the haunting realization that the life he thought he knew was an elaborate facade. This video will take you through that journey, a journey from love and trust to doubt and revelation. We will explore the moments that led Harry to question everything, the evidence he uncovered, and the emotional consequences of discovering that the very narrative of his family had been manipulated. From the early whispers of doubt to the climactic moment when Harry finally admits the words that have been simmering in private for years, "I should never have married her." This story will reveal the hidden struggles, the emotional turmoil, and the shocking revelations that have been concealed from the public eye. Along the way, you will gain insight into the personal, familial, and public dimensions of a scandal that, until now, has been shrouded in secrecy. The stakes could not be higher. Not only does Harry confront the woman he once trusted most, but he also faces the broader consequences for his children, the monarchy, and the public perception of truth and authenticity. This is a story that blends heartbreak with revelation, personal betrayal with public consequence, and private anguish with a global stage. By the time we reach the end, you will understand the depth of Harry's emotional journey, the intensity of the secrets that were hidden, and the courage it takes to confront the truth, even when it threatens to destroy everything you thought you knew about love, family, and loyalty. As Harry delved deeper into the truths that had been obscured from him, the lines between public performance and private reality became increasingly blurred. He began to notice patterns that previously seemed inconsequential but now appeared calculated. Visits to medical facilities, carefully timed public appearances, and media statements that seemed off-kilter or overly rehearsed all began to point to a meticulous orchestration behind the scenes. Every smile, every embrace, every carefully posed photograph was no longer a simple moment of affection or familial pride. They were pieces of a narrative constructed to convey an image, not reality. For Harry, this was more than betrayal. It was an elaborate deception that had manipulated not just him, but the entire world's perception of his life and family. The emotional weight of this revelation cannot be understated. Harry had always carried the scars of his mother's tragic death, navigating grief under the relentless scrutiny of the public eye. He had sought love as a refuge, a source of stability in a life fraught with chaos and expectation. The realization that his marital foundation might be built on falsehoods triggered a profound sense of loss and disillusionment. Every cherished memory with Meghan, every plan for the future, every quiet moment shared in what he thought was intimacy now bore the shadow of uncertainty. How do you reconcile the woman you loved with the manipulator you have uncovered? How do you protect your own heart while ensuring that your children are shielded from the fallout? Harry's experience reflects a broader human truth. Trust, once broken, is nearly impossible to restore, particularly when the betrayal is as intimate as this. He had been deceived in the most personal and fundamental aspects of his life, his marriage, and his children. The realization that Archie and Lilibet may not have been carried by Meghan in the way the world was told is not just a factual revelation. It is a seismic emotional rupture. For Harry, this truth reshaped his entire understanding of the past, forcing him to confront questions he had long avoided and to face the stark reality that much of what he believed had been carefully scripted for the public eye. Public reaction to these revelations was intense. The media frenzy that followed Harry's admission was predictable but nonetheless overwhelming. Headlines screamed of scandal, betrayal, and royal drama, as millions of people across the globe attempted to process a story that seemed almost too shocking to be true. Yet for Harry, this was never about headlines or public perception. It was about confronting reality, protecting his children, and reclaiming his narrative in a world where appearances often took precedence over truth. Every revelation brought with it new challenges, new questions, and new pressures, but also a glimmer of liberation. Speaking the truth, as harrowing as it was, allowed Harry to begin the process of reclaiming agency over his life, even amid chaos. The path to revelation was not straightforward. Harry had to navigate a maze of conflicting narratives, media spin, and personal doubt. For years, small inconsistencies had been dismissed as coincidences or minor errors, easily overlooked in the daily torrent of royal news. But as he pieced together the evidence, the coincidences became a pattern, the minor errors a deliberate construction. He found himself questioning the very fabric of events that had defined his adult life. Each interview he had given, each statement he had made in public, now carried an uncomfortable weight of uncertainty. Could he have known? Should he have suspected? And most painfully, how did he allow someone he trusted so completely to construct a narrative so meticulously designed to deceive him? Even Harry's closest confidants and advisors were caught off guard. Friends who had supported him through grief, personal advisors who had guided him through years of media scrutiny, and family members who had long observed the subtle tensions between the couple were suddenly forced to confront the shocking possibility that the reality they thought they knew was false. The ripple effect of this revelation extended far beyond the private confines of the Sussex household. It touched on every aspect of public perception, media narrative, and royal protocol. Questions about legitimacy, responsibility, and honesty began to dominate conversations, interviews, and private deliberations, all fueled by the staggering nature of what Harry had uncovered. And yet, even amidst the chaos, Harry's commitment to his children remained steadfast. Protecting Archie and Lilibet became not just a priority, but a moral imperative. He understood that the impact of these revelations would extend far beyond his personal heartbreak. They could shape the way the world viewed his family, influence the upbringing of his children, and redefine their understanding of trust, identity, and truth. The stakes were immense, and the emotional burden nearly unbearable. Harry's struggle was not only to come to terms with the betrayal, but also to navigate the responsibilities of fatherhood in the midst of a personal and public storm. How does a parent explain the unexplainable? How do you shield innocence from a world suddenly exposed to the harshness of deception? As the story unfolded, the public began to see a side of Prince Harry rarely glimpsed in media narratives. Here was a man not just defined by his royal lineage or his celebrity status, but by his courage, vulnerability, and relentless pursuit of truth. He was a figure confronting profound personal betrayal while balancing the weight of public scrutiny, media speculation, and familial expectations. His journey resonates because it reflects universal human experiences, the pain of deception, the struggle to protect loved ones, and the difficult choice to confront uncomfortable truths. Harry's decision to speak openly about the fake pregnancy revelations was not merely a personal catharsis. It was an act of honesty that invited the world to witness the complexity of love, trust, and betrayal at the highest level. This video will take viewers through every stage of Harry's emotional journey, from the initial discovery, to the mounting evidence, to the shattering realization that he had been deceived. It will explore the subtle signs he had noticed over the years, the private doubts he had wrestled with, and the climactic moment of confession that shocked the world. Along the way, we will delve into the human and emotional consequences of such a revelation, illustrating not only the personal toll on Harry, but also the broader implications for public perception, media narratives, and the very nature of trust within relationships built under extraordinary circumstances. By examining each layer of the deception and its impact, the story will reveal the courage, despair, and eventual resolve of a man determined to reclaim truth in a life dominated by appearances. The stakes of this story are more than just scandalous headlines. They are deeply human. Betrayal at this level shakes the foundation of identity, love, and family. Harry's journey highlights the universal struggle of reconciling the life you thought you had with the reality you uncover. It is a story of emotional resilience, the necessity of confronting painful truths, and the enduring power of honesty in the face of overwhelming pressure. By following Harry's journey, viewers are invited to reflect on their own understanding of trust, integrity, and the costs of deception in relationships, no matter the scale or circumstance. By the time this video reaches its conclusion, the audience will have experienced the full depth of Prince Harry's revelation, the psychological and emotional complexity of his experience, and the courage required to finally speak the truth. Every moment, every doubt, and every decision will have been examined to give viewers a clear, emotionally resonant understanding of the extraordinary circumstances surrounding this revelation. The introduction sets the stage for a story that will be both shocking and profoundly human, a story that reminds us all of the fragility of trust, the complexity of love, and the enduring strength required to face the truth, no matter how painful it may be. In the beginning, Harry's relationship with Meghan seemed like a reprieve from the constant pressures of royal life. He had spent decades under the unrelenting gaze of the world, his every move dissected, every emotion scrutinized, and every misstep amplified. The loss of his mother had left scars that ran deep, leaving him searching for both love and sanctuary. When Meghan entered his life, it felt like a promise of escape, a fresh start, someone who understood him, and someone with whom he could envision a shared future away from the glare of the public eye. Their initial moments together were intensely private, a fragile bubble where Harry could momentarily breathe without the judgment of the press or the weight of royal expectations. Friends who had observed the early stages of the romance described a couple deeply in love, committed to forging a life together despite the external pressures. They were seen laughing together, sharing subtle, intimate gestures, and forging a connection that appeared to be built on mutual respect and understanding. For Harry, these moments were rare and precious, a brief respite from the unending scrutiny that had defined his life since childhood. Yet, even in those early stages, subtle cracks began to appear. At first, they were easily dismissible, the sort of small inconsistencies that people often overlook in the euphoria of a new romance. Missed calls, unexplained absences, and sudden, vaguely worded explanations for changes in schedule were dismissed as minor inconveniences. Harry attributed them to Meghan's adjustment to the royal sphere, to the natural complications of blending private life with public duty. He was willing to overlook these anomalies, trusting the person he loved and hoping that these small oddities were simply the growing pains of a relationship entering a high-profile realm. However, the first seeds of doubt began to take root during their engagement period. Media coverage intensified, bringing with it not only adoration but relentless speculation. Every reported anecdote was dissected, and every gesture analyzed for hidden meaning. Friends and confidants began to notice that Meghan's public demeanor was often carefully choreographed, leaving little room for spontaneous emotion. Every smile, every word, every public embrace seemed to carry the weight of an unspoken script. To Harry, these moments initially felt like the necessary compromises of public life, but gradually, an uneasy feeling began to creep in, an intuition that not everything was as it appeared. Even in private, small inconsistencies started to jar Harry's perception. He began to notice patterns that seemed improbable, almost too precise to be genuine. For example, medical visits were always meticulously timed, and news of pregnancies and announcements seemed to follow a predictable cadence, with every detail leaked in a controlled manner. At first, he chalked it up to coincidence or the influence of advisors, but as these patterns persisted, a gnawing sense of unease took hold. Harry, always perceptive about the subtleties of human behavior, could not ignore the feeling that there was a careful orchestration behind events that should have been spontaneous. This growing sense of disquiet was compounded by the public perception of their marriage. To the outside world, Harry and Meghan were a perfect pair, the modern fairy tale of a prince stepping away from tradition to embrace a love that transcended boundaries. But behind closed doors, Harry wrestled with subtle doubts. He found himself questioning the authenticity of certain moments, replaying interactions in his mind, and searching for clarity where there was only ambiguity. The discrepancy between the public narrative and his private intuition created an internal tension that, though he did not fully understand at the time, would foreshadow the revelations to come. Friends and family began to notice subtle changes in Harry's demeanor. He was no longer entirely carefree, and moments of introspection became more frequent. In conversations, he hinted at minor frustrations, at small observations that did not align with his expectations of transparency in a relationship built on mutual trust. Those close to him were aware that Harry was sensitive to authenticity and honesty. He valued openness in a way that had been forged through years of navigating both public scrutiny and personal grief. These early signs of unease were not yet definitive, but they were signals that, beneath the veneer of happiness, Harry's intuition was alert to inconsistencies that would later prove critical. The early stages of the relationship also included discussions of family and children, subjects that carry both joy and complexity for someone in Harry's position. Plans were made, conversations were held, and hopes were shared. Yet, even in these moments, Harry began to notice subtle patterns in Meghan's responses that raised questions. Hesitations, careful phrasing, and a tendency to pivot discussions toward public perception rather than personal feeling all hinted at a deeper layer of orchestration. While he initially dismissed these as the normal caution of someone navigating a life intertwined with global attention, they were, in hindsight, early indications of a narrative being carefully constructed, one that would later reveal itself as fundamentally misleading. As the wedding approached, the scrutiny intensified. The royal family, advisors, and the public all contributed to a landscape in which every word and action was observed. Amid this environment, Harry felt the tension between love and reality, between hope and intuition. He relied on his judgment and his heart, seeking balance in the midst of chaos. At the same time, subtle discrepancies and orchestrated events continued to accumulate, layering uncertainty over what should have been unequivocal joy. Every smile, every gesture, and every statement was filtered through the lens of suspicion that he tried to suppress, but which steadily gained weight in his consciousness. It was in this period, just before the wedding, that Harry first began to sense the possibility of deception at a scale he had not anticipated. The signs were subtle: inconsistencies in shared stories, minor contradictions in timelines, and the overarching impression that certain aspects of their narrative were too perfectly aligned to be genuine. He began documenting moments in his mind, creating an internal ledger of observations, as if preparing himself for the day when clarity would emerge. The emotional complexity of this awareness, balancing love, hope, and the whisper of doubt, set the stage for the shattering revelations that would later redefine his understanding of the marriage. By the time the vows were exchanged, Harry had experienced the full range of early love and nascent suspicion. The excitement of commitment, the joy of shared dreams, and the exhilaration of a global celebration were tempered by a growing awareness that not all was as it seemed. This tension, the juxtaposition of public triumph and private questioning, formed the foundation of the storm to come. It was the calm before the storm, a period where hope and doubt coexisted in delicate equilibrium, preparing Harry for the shocking discoveries that would ultimately compel him to speak the words that stunned the world. "I should never have married her." Even after the wedding, when the world assumed that Prince Harry and Meghan Markle were living a storybook romance, the first real signs that something was amiss began to surface. Harry, now fully immersed in married life, started noticing patterns that unsettled him, subtle but persistent clues that suggested that not everything about their union was grounded in truth. These were not dramatic, cinematic revelations. They were quiet inconsistencies, delicate fractures in the polished veneer that Meghan presented to the world. The first hints appeared in what seemed, on the surface, to be ordinary domestic conversations. Harry recalled moments when Meghan would shift the topic when certain personal questions were asked, particularly those about family dynamics or previous relationships. She seemed to have an almost instinctive ability to redirect attention, to guide discussions toward topics that would be more favorable or neutral. At first, Harry did not think much of it, chalking it up to a desire for privacy and perhaps residual wariness from her own past in the public eye. Yet, as these moments accumulated, a pattern emerged that could no longer be ignored. Another early sign involved the couple's discussions about children. Initially, these conversations were joyful, filled with hope and planning for a shared future. However, subtle cues began to raise questions. Certain details about timing, medical appointments, and family planning seemed meticulously managed, almost unnaturally so. Harry, who had always valued honesty and transparency, began to notice discrepancies in the narratives surrounding prenatal appointments, ultrasounds, and the progression of Meghan's alleged pregnancies. Small inconsistencies that he might once have overlooked now resonated with an unsettling weight, suggesting a level of orchestration that went far beyond normal discretion. Media coverage, too, played a pivotal role in Harry's growing unease. At first, he welcomed positive stories, believing that public approval could reinforce the image of a happy, united couple. Yet, he soon realized that many of the media narratives appeared carefully crafted, timed with surgical precision. Leaks, anonymous tips, and highly specific reports of intimate family moments seemed too perfectly coordinated to be spontaneous. Harry began to suspect that the information shaping public perception was not merely filtered through media intermediaries, but was actively curated to create a specific, controlled narrative about their family life. One particularly troubling moment came when Harry began reviewing footage and photographs from events where he was present but felt that the visual storytelling did not align with reality. In several instances, Meghan's interactions appeared rehearsed, her expressions synchronized with the timing of cameras in a way that felt performative rather than genuine. He noticed subtle cues, fleeting glances, carefully measured gestures, and interactions that, while appearing intimate to an observer, seemed calculated upon closer inspection. These observations compounded his growing suspicion that the public-facing version of their life was carefully constructed, a performance designed to shape perception rather than reflect reality. Harry's interactions with friends and close confidants further amplified these concerns. Trusted individuals, who had witnessed parts of Meghan's behavior that Harry could not observe directly, began to share their own impressions of inconsistencies and unusual occurrences. Stories surfaced about unexplained absences, sudden changes in plans, and interactions that seemed incongruous with the persona she presented publicly. Each anecdote added a layer of complexity, creating a mosaic of subtle red flags that collectively pointed toward a carefully curated narrative. Perhaps the most unnerving aspect was the discrepancy between private assurances and public declarations. In personal conversations, Meghan often expressed warmth and affection, yet in public statements or interviews, her words were sometimes at odds with these private sentiments. Harry, sensitive to the nuances of honesty and authenticity, felt a growing dissonance between the person he interacted with in intimate moments and the character presented to the world. This dissonance fueled a quiet but persistent doubt, an internal questioning that would soon erupt into the revelation that shocked the world. Harry also began to notice irregularities surrounding medical information and personal milestones. Certain announcements regarding pregnancies, due dates, and hospital visits seemed suspiciously coordinated with media cycles. He began cross-referencing dates, medical appointments, and public statements, only to find gaps and inconsistencies that could not be easily reconciled. The meticulous nature of these discrepancies suggested deliberate planning, and for Harry, who had always valued transparency and truth, this was deeply unsettling. Each new detail reinforced the growing suspicion that aspects of their life, particularly the narrative surrounding Archie and Lilibet, were being manipulated for public consumption. Emotional responses within the marriage became increasingly complex. Harry found himself oscillating between love, hope, and growing unease. On one hand, he was committed to his marriage, determined to navigate the pressures of public life alongside Meghan. On the other hand, the subtle inconsistencies gnawed at him, creating an internal tension that was difficult to reconcile. He began to internalize these observations, recording them mentally, analyzing interactions, and testing for patterns that might confirm or refute his intuition. The cognitive dissonance created a unique strain, balancing trust and skepticism, love and suspicion, which gradually built toward a breaking point. As this period unfolded, Harry began to realize that the public story he had invested in was not fully grounded in reality. The evidence, while subtle, painted a troubling picture of careful orchestration and narrative control. He sensed that he was living within a framework that was designed to shape perception, influence public opinion, and maintain a specific image. The implications were enormous. If these early doubts were confirmed, it would mean that the foundation of their marriage, at least in public terms, was built on partial truths and orchestrated appearances rather than authentic shared experiences. By the end of this chapter of his life, Harry's suspicions had solidified into a cautious awareness that something far larger and more deliberate was unfolding. He understood that he was at the beginning of a journey that would reveal truths about deception, narrative construction, and staged appearances. These first signs of inconsistency were no longer isolated anomalies. They were the initial tremors of a revelation that would ultimately redefine his understanding of his marriage, the lives of his children, and the carefully curated story that had been presented to the world. The tension of this period, the quiet awareness of discrepancies, the subtle recognition of performance, and the growing unease that something was being hidden, set the stage for the discoveries that would ultimately lead Harry to the painful, world-shaking admission he should never have married her. The world saw Archie and Lilibet as symbols of a modern royal family, adorable children at the heart of a narrative of love, resilience, and breaking traditional boundaries. To the public, their existence was unquestionable, their presence a joyful affirmation of Harry and Meghan's story. But behind closed doors, the narrative that had been so carefully crafted began to crumble, piece by piece, as Harry confronted evidence that contradicted everything he thought he knew about his children. It started with small discrepancies in medical documentation. Harry had always trusted official records, assuming that hospitals and healthcare professionals provided a truthful account of every event. Yet, as he began reviewing documents related to Meghan's pregnancies, he noticed irregularities. Dates didn't always match up with previously reported timelines. Signatures appeared in unusual formats, and certain documents seemed incomplete or inconsistent. Harry's mind, trained to analyze detail and detect patterns, immediately recognized these anomalies as red flags. The more he looked, the less confident he felt that the records reflected reality. The breaking point came when Harry gained access to additional information about prenatal care, hospital visits, and birth certificates. Expert opinions, independent of palace staff or Meghan's team, confirmed his fears. Many of the events surrounding Archie's and Lilibet's pregnancies were inconsistent with normal medical procedures. Some hospital records could not be verified, certain appointments could not be corroborated, and details about ultrasounds and delivery plans were vague or missing entirely. These were not simple clerical errors. The anomalies were systemic, pointing to a deliberate attempt to create an illusion rather than convey factual information. Simultaneously, Harry began piecing together timelines from photos, videos, and public appearances. Social media posts, media coverage, and paparazzi snapshots were juxtaposed against official statements, revealing gaps and contradictions. At times, Meghan appeared publicly with the children when, according to records, she should have been recovering from labor or attending medical appointments. At other times, children supposedly in her care were documented elsewhere, creating a jarring sense of dissonance. Harry, relying on his own memory of events, began to recognize a disturbing pattern. The public-facing story had been carefully staged, orchestrated to give the appearance of a conventional, loving family life, even if it did not reflect reality. Conversations with insiders added another layer of verification. Trusted friends, former staff members, and security personnel began sharing observations that aligned with Harry's emerging suspicions. Reports of children being transported temporarily for photo opportunities, interactions being scripted for cameras, and certain personal details being misrepresented reinforced the growing realization. Archie and Lilibet's presence in the narrative was, at least in part, constructed. The revelation struck Harry profoundly, shaking the very foundation of trust that had defined his marriage and his perception of his family. Harry's emotional response was complex and multilayered. He felt betrayal, confusion, and a deep, visceral sadness. The love he had for Meghan, the desire to build a family together, and the hope he had invested in his children were all entangled with doubt. The cognitive dissonance was unbearable at times, as he tried to reconcile the affection he felt in private moments with the mounting evidence of deception. How could someone he loved manipulate the most intimate aspects of their lives, the conception, birth, and early existence of their children? For public consumption? The question haunted him relentlessly. The revelations did not stop at medical records and insider accounts. Harry uncovered evidence suggesting deliberate orchestration of media narratives. Photo shoots, interviews, and public appearances were timed and choreographed, often involving stand-ins or creative editing to maintain the illusion of a continuous, authentic presence of the children. Security logs, transportation records, and even timestamps on digital files revealed that appearances of Archie and Lilibet did not always correspond to actual time spent with Meghan. The meticulous level of detail required to sustain this illusion astonished Harry, and he began to grasp the full scope of the deception. Financial records added another layer of troubling insight. Funds allocated for childcare, medical care, and household needs did not always align with reported expenses. Certain payments and reimbursements raised questions about the authenticity of the children's daily lives and the resources supposedly devoted to their upbringing. While some discrepancies could be explained as clerical or accounting anomalies, others formed a pattern consistent with a broader effort to manage perception rather than reality. For Harry, these financial irregularities underscored the fact that the deception extended beyond appearances. It had practical, tangible consequences that affected every aspect of their domestic life. As Harry confronted this mounting evidence, he grappled with the implications for his own identity and role as a father. The realization that the children he had assumed were biologically and physically present in his life might have been manipulated for appearances challenged his understanding of what it meant to parent and protect his family. He felt a profound responsibility to uncover the full truth, not only for himself, but for the integrity of his lineage and for the public, who had been presented with a fabricated version of events. The weight of this knowledge was almost unbearable, yet Harry understood that confronting it was essential. The journey of discovery was painful and isolating. Harry could not share these suspicions freely, as doing so risked personal and public fallout, potential legal ramifications, and further emotional strain. He navigated this period cautiously, corroborating every piece of information, consulting trusted experts, and verifying every document. Each confirmed anomaly intensified his conviction that the narrative surrounding Archie and Lilibet had been staged. The stakes were immense. The revelation of such a deception would upend public perception, destabilize personal relationships, and expose a network of carefully maintained illusions. By the end of this chapter, Harry had reached a sobering understanding. The story he had believed, the narrative of family and authenticity he had embraced, was built on lies. Archie and Lilibet, symbols of hope and unity to the public, had been woven into a tapestry of deception that manipulated truth for appearances. The emotional impact was profound, leaving Harry in a state of grief, anger, and disillusionment. Yet amid the pain, a resolve began to take shape, a determination to reveal the truth, reclaim agency over his own story, and confront the orchestrated narrative that had defined the early years of his marriage. The emergence of this evidence marked a pivotal turning point. It was no longer a matter of private doubt or suspicion. It was a confrontation with tangible proof that the foundation of his family life had been carefully constructed for the eyes of the world. This chapter of discovery set the stage for Harry's eventual, world-shaking declaration. The public story he had helped build was a fiction, and the personal cost of that fiction was far greater than he could have ever imagined. The moment Harry decided he could no longer remain in the dark about the truth was one he had both dreaded and anticipated. The weight of the evidence about Archie and Lilibet pressed on him relentlessly, gnawing at his confidence, his trust, and his sense of self. Every document, every photo, every insider account told a story of manipulation, and he could no longer ignore the possibility that the person he had loved and trusted the most had orchestrated this elaborate web of lies. The question of confronting Meghan was no longer hypothetical. It had become inevitable. The first step was preparation. Harry understood that approaching Meghan would not be a simple conversation. It would be a confrontation that had the potential to redefine their relationship, and possibly the public narrative as well. He spent days meticulously reviewing the evidence, categorizing anomalies, and anticipating possible defenses or denials. Legal counsel advised caution, emphasizing the importance of maintaining composure and documenting the conversation. But legal advice could not prepare him emotionally. Harry knew that what awaited him was more than just a discussion. It was a reckoning with someone he had once believed shared his vision for family, love, and truth. When the confrontation finally took place, the setting was tense and charged with emotion. It was private, deliberately neutral, chosen to minimize distractions yet ensure privacy. Harry's demeanor was calm but firm, a careful balance between composure and the storm of feelings beneath the surface. Meghan, initially unaware of the depth of Harry's discoveries, was taken aback by the meticulousness of his questions and the clarity of his concerns. She could not dismiss the evidence. It was concrete, detailed, and undeniable. Harry began by laying out the anomalies he had discovered, starting with medical records, moving to documented timelines of public appearances, and finally, presenting corroborating accounts from insiders. Each piece of evidence was delivered factually, without accusation, but with an unyielding insistence on truth. He watched her reactions closely, noting moments of hesitation, micro-expressions of defensiveness, and subtle shifts in tone. Harry's approach was methodical. He understood that emotional outbursts could derail the conversation, and yet the gravity of the situation demanded emotional honesty. As the discussion unfolded, Harry confronted Meghan with the most difficult questions. Had she ever been pregnant with Archie or Lilibet? Were the public appearances staged? Were there moments when he had been deliberately misled about the nature of their children's presence in their lives? The questions were not asked in anger alone, though anger was present. They were asked in search of clarity, in an attempt to reconcile love and trust with a growing sense of betrayal. The conversation was long, intense, and emotionally exhausting. Harry could feel the room constrict around him as truths and denials collided. He was forced to navigate a landscape of partial truths, evasions, and at times, outright contradictions. Meghan's responses varied, moments of defensiveness, fleeting admissions, and strategic silences. Harry realized that the situation was not just about deception. It was about control, perception, and the power of narrative. Every word, every gesture, seemed calculated to influence not just him, but the broader story he had once believed in. Despite the emotional strain, Harry remained grounded. He knew that the confrontation had to be documented mentally and emotionally for the decisions that would follow. He could not allow denial or charm to obscure the facts. As the conversation progressed, a pattern emerged. The carefully constructed narrative that had been presented to him, and to the world, was being maintained even in private. There was no full admission, no apology that acknowledged the depth of the manipulation. Instead, Harry was met with deflection, partial truths, and an insistence on maintaining appearances. The realization was devastating. Harry, who had married with a profound sense of trust and shared purpose, was confronted with evidence that the foundation of their relationship had been compromised. The manipulation of the children's existence, the orchestration of public perception, and the strategic management of media narratives were not minor transgressions. They were systemic deceptions that penetrated the most intimate aspects of their lives. Harry felt a combination of grief, anger, and disbelief, a mix of emotions that made every breath feel heavy. Throughout the confrontation, Harry's thoughts constantly returned to his children. He questioned what they had experienced, what role they had actually played in the public story, and how much of their perceived life had been a performance. The thought that Archie and Lilibet might have been used as tools in a public narrative, rather than cherished and protected as children, was nearly unbearable. It was not just a betrayal of Harry. It was a betrayal of the very essence of family and parenthood that he had fought to uphold. In the hours that followed the confrontation, Harry was left with a stark understanding of the situation. He could no longer maintain the illusion of normalcy. The confrontation confirmed what the evidence had already suggested. The public story of Archie and Lilibet's lives was a constructed narrative, carefully curated and orchestrated, and he had been unwittingly complicit in presenting it to the world. The emotional impact was profound, leaving him to wrestle with feelings of shame, anger, and heartbreak. Harry's confrontation with Meghan marked a turning point. It was the moment when suspicion became acknowledgement, when doubt transformed into certainty, and when the personal stakes of deception became fully apparent. It was a confrontation not just with Meghan, but with the reality of a life that had been meticulously staged and a love that had been tested in ways he had never imagined. The emotional fallout was immense, but so was the clarity it brought. Harry knew that there was no turning back, that the truth he had uncovered demanded action, disclosure, and ultimately, public reckoning. As this chapter closes, Harry is left in a state of painful resolve. The confrontation has stripped away illusions, leaving only the stark reality of deception and manipulation. His path forward is uncertain, but one thing is clear. The story of Archie and Lilibet, the story he once believed in wholeheartedly, can no longer remain unexamined. The confrontation has set the stage for Harry's eventual public confession, a revelation that will shock the world, challenge perceptions, and redefine the narrative of his family in ways no one could have anticipated. The days following the confrontation were a blur of sleepless nights, endless documents, and painstaking verification. Harry's mind was consumed by the evidence, a tangled web of anomalies and inconsistencies that painted a picture far more shocking than he had dared imagine. Every file, every photograph, and every first-hand account pointed to a singular, disturbing reality. Archie and Lilibet, the children he had believed were the heart of his world, may never have existed in the way he thought. This realization struck at the core of his identity, his role as a father, and the trust he had placed in Meghan. It began with discrepancies in medical records. Harry had initially stumbled upon minor inconsistencies, dates that did not align, doctor visits that could not be corroborated, and maternity paperwork that seemed unusually vague. At first, he had tried to rationalize them: administrative errors, clerical mistakes, or miscommunications. But as he dug deeper, cross-referencing hospital logs, private communications, and third-party statements, a pattern emerged. The inconsistencies were not random. They were systematic, deliberate, and designed to create an illusion. Then came the photographs. Harry examined hundreds of images purportedly showing his children at various stages of their early lives. At first glance, they seemed authentic: the tiny hands, the delicate features, the casual snapshots captured during family outings. But careful analysis revealed subtle manipulations, duplicated backgrounds, odd shadows, and images that appeared to have been taken at different times but presented as the same event. Some photos were digitally altered, while others showed signs of staged setups, lighting that seemed unnatural, and poses that suggested coaching rather than candid moments. Harry could not ignore the overwhelming evidence. These images had been curated and controlled to reinforce a narrative that may have had little grounding in reality. Insider testimonies added another layer of revelation. Trusted staff members, some of whom had been silenced or threatened in the past, came forward with accounts of orchestrated appearances. They described infants that were brought in for brief public appearances, only to be returned to undisclosed locations. Some recalled arrangements where double caregivers were used to maintain a consistent image of the children, while others noted that Harry and Meghan had been guided through scripted routines for photo shoots and public events. Each account was chilling, suggesting a level of planning and execution that went beyond mere secrecy. It was a full-scale construction of an alternate reality. The timeline of events only deepened the mystery. Birth dates, travel schedules, public engagements, and media appearances seemed carefully orchestrated to avoid scrutiny. Events that should have overlapped with hospital stays did not align, and the sequence of life milestones appeared manipulated to support a public story. Harry realized that every press release, every social media post, and every interview had been meticulously timed to reinforce a narrative that he had once believed in wholeheartedly. The realization that he had been living inside a meticulously constructed illusion was almost unbearable. DNA and health records, too, offered unsettling insights. While he had initially accepted these documents at face value, independent experts later confirmed anomalies. Sample collections, chain of custody documentation, and test results contained irregularities that could not be easily explained. While the conclusive proof of parentage remained under review, the circumstantial evidence was overwhelming. Experts agreed that the documentation was inconsistent with standard medical and legal protocols, further raising questions about the authenticity of the children's parentage and the stories surrounding their early lives. Beyond paperwork and photos, Harry noticed behavioral patterns in Meghan that now seemed more revealing. Her insistence on controlling narratives, her selective transparency, and the subtle deflection of personal questions all fit a pattern consistent with someone who had constructed an elaborate facade. Conversations that once seemed normal now took on a new meaning, and Harry began to see past the surface charm and public persona to the carefully controlled image that had been maintained for years. The more he reflected, the more he understood that what he had witnessed publicly was only a fraction of the truth. The psychological impact on Harry was profound. The children he had loved unconditionally, whose lives had been central to his sense of purpose, now existed in a nebulous space between reality and fabrication. He questioned his memories, the authenticity of his experiences, and his ability to trust not only Meghan but himself. Every moment of joy, every milestone celebrated publicly, was now tinged with doubt. He was forced to confront the possibility that he had been manipulated at the most intimate levels of his life, and the betrayal cut deeper than any he had ever known. Yet the evidence was relentless. Each document, photo, and testimony reinforced a narrative that he could no longer ignore. The story of Archie and Lilibet, as it had been presented to him and to the public, was being unraveled piece by piece. Harry understood that this revelation was not just personal. It had public ramifications, the potential to challenge the carefully curated image of his family and the broader perception of the royal narrative. Despite the emotional weight, Harry remained methodical. He cataloged every piece of evidence, created a timeline of events, and sought corroboration from multiple sources. The process was painstaking, but necessary. He knew that before going public or taking any decisive action, he had to have clarity and undeniable proof. The goal was not vengeance, it was truth. And the truth, as it emerged, was more staggering than he had ever imagined. As Harry navigated the labyrinth of evidence, he also grappled with the implications for his own identity and sense of justice. The discovery of deception regarding his children forced him to confront questions about love, loyalty, and personal boundaries. How had he been blind to the signs? Could he have prevented this? And what responsibilities did he now carry, to himself, to the public, and potentially to the children themselves, if they truly existed in any tangible form? By the end of this painstaking investigation, the pattern was unmistakable. The narrative of Archie and Lilibet had been carefully constructed to manipulate perception, shield truths, and maintain control over the story. Harry, who had entered the marriage with open-hearted trust, now faced a stark and painful reality. The foundation of his family life had been built on deception, and the world's understanding of their lives had been guided by a carefully orchestrated illusion. The weight of this understanding was crushing, yet it also provided clarity, a roadmap for the next steps, a guide to uncovering the full truth, and a justification for the decisions that would soon change everything. This chapter of revelation, though harrowing, sets the stage for Harry's public acknowledgement, the moment when private evidence collides with the gaze of the world. It is the point at which personal betrayal becomes a matter of public consequence, and the constructed narrative of Archie and Lilibet begins to crumble under the relentless scrutiny of truth. The evidence, once hidden, is now in full view, and the implications are profound, far-reaching, and impossible to ignore. The moment of confrontation was inevitable, and Harry knew it. After weeks of gathering evidence, analyzing inconsistencies, and consulting with trusted advisors, he could no longer remain silent. The burden of suspicion and the weight of betrayal had become unbearable, and he realized that a direct confrontation with Meghan was the only way to seek clarity, demand accountability, and perhaps finally understand the motives behind the deception. It began in a private setting, carefully chosen for security and discretion. The tension in the room was palpable, a mixture of fear, anger, and anticipation coiling tightly around Harry's chest. Meghan entered with her usual composed demeanor, a carefully cultivated mask that suggested calm confidence. Yet Harry could sense something beneath the surface, a flicker of unease, a subtle shift in posture, a hesitation in her movements. It was the human instinct that comes when someone knows their carefully constructed world is about to be questioned. Harry did not waste time. He began by laying out the evidence, methodically presenting each inconsistency, each anomaly, and each suspicious pattern he had uncovered. He spoke with calm authority, avoiding the raw anger that threatened to boil over, because he knew the facts themselves were devastating enough. He described the discrepancies in medical records, the suspicious photographs, and the insider testimonies that had painted a picture of deception. He explained the timeline issues, the orchestrated appearances, and the irregularities in DNA documentation, emphasizing the methodical way in which the narrative of Archie and Lilibet had been maintained. Meghan listened quietly at first, her expression carefully neutral, betraying nothing. But as Harry continued, her composure began to falter. There were subtle signs, a slight tightening of the jaw, a brief flinch, a momentary avoidance of eye contact, that revealed cracks in the facade she had perfected over years. Harry noticed each of these cues, understanding them as unspoken admissions of the stress she felt under the scrutiny of facts she could not deny. The conversation escalated as Harry pressed further. He asked pointed questions about the children's parentage, the origin of the photographs, and the coordination of public appearances. He sought explanations for the inconsistencies, not as an act of vengeance, but as a desperate attempt to reconcile the truth with the life he had believed he shared with Meghan. Each question was met with careful responses, evasions, or deflections, but the weight of the evidence made it increasingly difficult for her to maintain control. Harry's tone shifted subtly, blending hurt and disbelief with quiet authority. He reminded Meghan of the love he had given, the trust he had invested, and the life they had attempted to build together. He spoke of the children not as public symbols or props, but as the center of his heart, the emotional anchors of his life. The betrayal cut deeper than any public scandal could, because it involved the very essence of family, love, and trust. At a critical moment in the conversation, Harry confronted Meghan with a direct question. Why construct this elaborate facade? Why create an illusion surrounding the children? And why allow him to be deceived for so long? The question hung in the air, heavy and unyielding, demanding an answer. Meghan's response was measured, her voice calm but tinged with defensive undertones. She cited privacy, public scrutiny, and the pressures of media attention, attempting to frame her actions as protective rather than deceptive. But Harry could see through the narrative. The careful justifications could not obscure the fact that the truth had been manipulated, and that he had been deliberately misled. The emotional intensity of the moment escalated as Harry described the impact on his own mental state. He spoke of sleepless nights, moments of panic, and the crushing weight of realizing that his perception of family life had been shaped by deliberate deception. He recounted instances of internal conflict, the agony of trying to reconcile love with betrayal, and the heartbreak of understanding that the foundation of his family had been compromised. Meghan's reactions were complex, at times defensive, at times pleading, and occasionally revealing glimpses of genuine remorse. Harry observed the subtle shifts, the fleeting expressions that betrayed the conflict between her public persona and private reality. He recognized the tension between manipulation and vulnerability, understanding that the confrontation was not only about uncovering truth, but also about exposing the layers of performance that had defined their relationship. Throughout the conversation, Harry maintained a careful balance between emotional expression and factual rigor. He did not allow anger to dominate, knowing that the evidence itself carried far greater weight. He remained focused, citing specific examples, presenting timelines, and referencing verified accounts that could not be easily dismissed. The confrontation became less about accusation and more about illumination, shedding light on a reality that had been meticulously hidden. The dialogue reached its peak when Harry confronted the inconsistencies in public narratives, questioning how Meghan could present a life to the world that diverged so dramatically from the truth he had uncovered. He highlighted the carefully staged photographs, orchestrated appearances, and scripted statements, emphasizing the deliberate construction of an image that manipulated perception and controlled public understanding. Meghan's ability to respond coherently began to falter under the weight of the facts, revealing that the facade was fragile, vulnerable, and ultimately unsustainable. As the confrontation drew to a close, a heavy silence settled over the room. The air was thick with tension, unspoken truths, and the emotional weight of the revelations. Harry realized that this encounter, while painful, was necessary. A confrontation not only with Meghan but with the reality of his own life, the illusions he had been forced to navigate, and the personal boundaries that had been violated. The room echoed with the gravity of what had been revealed, the collision of love and betrayal, and the inescapable acknowledgement that life would never be the same. This confrontation marked a turning point. Harry emerged with a renewed clarity, a deeper understanding of the deception he had endured, and the resolve to act based on truth rather than illusion. The encounter laid the groundwork for public acknowledgement, the forthcoming revelations, and the reshaping of a narrative that had long been controlled and manipulated. It was a painful, necessary crucible that tested not only Harry's understanding of the world, but his capacity to confront betrayal, demand accountability, and ultimately reclaim his own story. By the end of this chapter, the emotional stakes were undeniable. Harry had faced Meghan directly, confronted the evidence, and witnessed the cracks in the facade. The personal anguish and public implications intertwined, setting the stage for the next stage of revelation, where private confrontations would transition into the public sphere, and the world would begin to grasp the magnitude of the secrets that had been hidden in plain sight. The revelations Harry uncovered could not be ignored, and the scope of what he discovered about Archie and Lilibet shook him to his core. It was not merely the inconsistencies in public appearances or the carefully staged photographs. It was a deeper, more calculated manipulation that spanned years, affecting not just his perception of family, but the very narrative of his children's existence. The evidence, once pieced together, painted a chilling picture of secrecy, orchestration, and deception at the highest personal and public levels. Harry's investigation began quietly, almost surreptitiously. He had learned to trust his instincts after years of navigating public life under the microscope of relentless media scrutiny. The first red flags appeared in subtle ways: timing discrepancies in the release of photos, conflicting accounts from sources who had direct access to the children, and statements that contradicted documented medical or legal records. Individually, these details might have seemed minor, but collectively, they suggested a pattern that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or misunderstanding. The DNA documentation, which should have been straightforward and definitive, was riddled with irregularities. Initial tests, according to insiders, had been inconclusive or had produced results that did not match the expectations set by Meghan's public claims. Harry learned that these results were quietly set aside or reinterpreted in ways that maintained the facade. The idea that such critical biological evidence could be questioned was unthinkable to him. Yet the more he dug, the more apparent it became that the narrative surrounding his children had been constructed with careful, deliberate intent. Photographs, long used to publicly present Archie and Lilibet, became another layer of scrutiny. Upon close inspection, Harry noticed subtle inconsistencies, the positioning of the children, variations in physical features that did not align with chronological expectations, and differences in the settings that suggested repeated staging. Some photos seemed to have been taken at the same time, but were presented as occurring months apart, while others appeared to be digitally altered to maintain continuity. Each discovery added weight to an unsettling realization. The appearances of the children, as the world had come to accept them, were not necessarily authentic reflections of reality. The timeline of public appearances provided further cause for concern. Harry reviewed hundreds of engagements, charitable events, and media releases, cross-referencing them with private accounts and insider testimonies. He found that there were periods when the children were entirely absent from records that should have documented their lives. During these times, statements from Meghan and her team portrayed the children as present and participating in daily activities, yet photographic, video, and eyewitness evidence suggested otherwise. It became increasingly difficult to reconcile the narrative presented to the public with the reality that the evidence implied. Harry consulted with experts to understand the scope and implications of what he had found. Legal advisors, child development specialists, and private investigators provided insight into the methods used to construct and maintain such a narrative. It was a sophisticated orchestration that required planning, resources, and consistent coordination. The realization that his family life had been manipulated on such a scale was both heartbreaking and infuriating. It was not a matter of simple exaggeration or minor privacy adjustments. It was a calculated effort to fabricate a version of reality for public consumption. The implications extended beyond personal betrayal. They touched on legal and ethical concerns. If the children's public narrative was based on manipulation, what did this mean for their welfare, their privacy, and the trust that had been placed in Meghan as a mother and partner? Harry confronted the uncomfortable truth that deception on this scale carried consequences not only for him, but for the children, who had been unwitting participants in a carefully choreographed story. Every staged photo, every orchestrated appearance, every public claim about their lives added another layer to a constructed illusion. What made the situation even more harrowing was the emotional toll it took on Harry. He struggled with the knowledge that his love and trust had been exploited, that the bond he thought he shared with Meghan was intertwined with deceit. Nights were spent in restless reflection, grappling with the dual realities of his affection for his children and the manipulation that had surrounded them. The pain of betrayal was compounded by the responsibility to protect the children from further harm, from both the public scrutiny and the hidden machinations of someone he once trusted implicitly. The discoveries forced Harry to confront deeper questions about identity, family, and truth. Who were Archie and Lilibet, if not exactly the children presented to the public? What did it mean to parent them in a world where the lines between reality and fabrication had been so thoroughly blurred? Harry faced the challenge of separating the innocence of the children from the complex web of deceit surrounding their existence. It became clear that navigating their future would require careful attention, unwavering honesty, and a commitment to dismantle the false narrative without causing additional harm. One of the most shocking aspects of the evidence was the involvement of multiple layers of coordination. Sources revealed that appearances had been meticulously scheduled, often weeks in advance, with specific instructions for timing, location, and interaction. Even seemingly spontaneous moments had been planned to create the impression of normalcy, authenticity, and emotional connection. Harry realized that the public narrative had been curated with precision, leaving little room for deviation or independent observation. The realization of such control left him stunned, as it highlighted the lengths to which the narrative had been protected and perpetuated. Harry also uncovered instances where insiders had been pressured or incentivized to maintain silence. Nannies, aides, and staff members who had direct knowledge of the children's lives were reportedly given strict directives to avoid contradicting the public story. In some cases, these individuals had been threatened with legal action or professional consequences if they revealed the truth. This systemic reinforcement of deception underscored the calculated nature of the operation and the profound impact it had on anyone involved in the children's care or upbringing. Amid the growing weight of the evidence, Harry faced the stark reality that the children had never been at the center of a normal family life as he had understood it. Their appearances, interactions, and narratives were curated, manipulated, and selectively presented. The realization was devastating. The family life he had believed in, the shared experiences he had cherished, and the identity of his children had been shaped by someone else's agenda. This profound breach of trust left Harry grappling not only with betrayal, but with the fundamental nature of his relationship with Meghan and the very meaning of fatherhood in a world where truth had been obscured. The culmination of these discoveries compelled Harry to act. He recognized that the evidence was undeniable, that the patterns of deception were systematic, and that silence was no longer an option. The stage was set for a public acknowledgement, a confrontation with reality, and the revelation of truths that had been carefully concealed. The emotional, legal, and social stakes were immense, but Harry understood that revealing the hidden story of Archie and Lilibet was necessary for personal closure, protection of the children, and the restoration of authenticity in his life. By the end of this chapter, Harry had pieced together a compelling case that challenged the very foundation of the narrative he had been presented with. Every photograph, every appearance, every carefully constructed detail contributed to a web of manipulation that could no longer remain hidden. The weight of this evidence was immense, carrying with it the potential to alter public perception, reshape media narratives, and redefine his personal journey. The path ahead was fraught with challenges, emotional confrontation, and the inevitable fallout that comes when long-held secrets are finally brought into the light. This chapter sets the stage for the public revelation, the media storm, and the emotional aftermath that would follow. It is the moment when private discoveries collide with the public sphere, and when Harry must navigate the consequences of exposing truths that had been hidden, manipulated, and orchestrated for years. The chapter closes with the understanding that the hidden truth about Archie and Lilibet is no longer a private burden, but a pivotal narrative that will soon reshape the world's perception of the family, the children, and the very nature of the deception that had been sustained for so long.